Bern, Switzerland. The autumn of 1918. A gray office above a gray street, and a neutral
deployment
diplomat
is critical.
holding a sealed envelope he did not
Ensure
want to
all
carry.
units are aware of the new
Inside that
objective.
envelope was a formal charge from one great empire against another. An accusation of a war crime. Not for poison gas. Not
In
for
the freezing waters
flamethrowers
of
that
the
had turned
Atlantic,
men into
the
torches
battle
in
of the
mud Flanders.
convoys raged,
Not
a
for the
brutal
submarines
struggle for
sinking merchant
supremacy
ships without
beneath the
warning in
waves.
cold Atlantic.
We need to adjust the
The
specifications for
German
the casing.
Empire, the nation that
Let
had
me
written
verify the
treaties on
measurements
laws of
against the
war,
new blueprint.
The nation of precise ballistics and university-trained engineers was accusing the United States of a crime against the customs of civilized warfare. And the weapon at the center of that charge was a shotgun, a pump-action shotgun. A gun an American farmer might have leaned against his barn door to keep foxes out of the henhouse. If this kind of story, where American grit and ingenuity leave the best engineers in the world speechless, is something you care about, a like and a subscription genuinely help these stories reach more people who care about them too. Here is the question that will drive everything you are about to watch. What has to happen on a battlefield? What has to go so terribly wrong for one side that the most engineering-obsessed army on Earth looks at a hunting gun and calls it a war crime? Not a machine gun, not artillery, a shotgun. The answer is not what you expect. The answer has nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with a piece of American engineering so simple, so stubbornly effective that German military science had already declared it should not work at all. Let us start with the document itself, because it was real and the language in it was chilling. On the 19th of September 1918, a diplomatic note traveled the quiet channels that enemies use when they cannot speak directly. Germany could not send a message to Washington, so the protest passed through Switzerland, the neutral middleman, and landed on the desks of the United States government. The note protested the American use of shotguns in combat. It cited a specific piece of international law, Article 23, subsection E of the Hague Convention, the clause that forbids weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. And then it delivered the part that turned a legal complaint into a threat against living men. According to the laws of war, the note declared, every American prisoner found in possession of such a gun, or even the ammunition for it, forfeits his life. Read that again, slowly. Forfeits his life. Germany was not merely filing a complaint. Germany was announcing that any young American captured with a shotgun slung across his back would be executed, not held, not tried. Executed on the spot for carrying the wrong gun. Now sit inside the strangeness of that moment, because the strangeness is the whole story. This was the fourth year of a war that had rewritten the meaning of the word horror. Chlorine gas had drifted across the trenches at Ypres, searing the lungs of men who drowned standing up in open air. Flamethrowers had been dragged into the German assault tactics as standard equipment. Artillery barrages lasting days had ground entire villages, and the men defending them into powder. And the nation that had introduced much of that horror to the modern battlefield was now reaching for its pen, invoking the language of law and mercy and civilized limits over a shotgun. The army of poison and flame was accusing the army of buckshot of going too far. That contradiction is not a footnote. It is the doorway into everything that follows. Because the German protest was not really about suffering, and the men who wrote it knew it. Their own arsenal made that argument impossible to take at face value. Something else was driving that note out of Germany and through Switzerland with a demand for an answer by cable before the 1st of October. Something was happening in the trenches of the Western Front that the German command could not stop, could not counter, and, most tellingly of all, could not copy. Here is what makes this an engineering story and not just a story about a piece of paper. When a great technical power files a legal protest against a simple weapon, you should ask a very specific question. Why not just build one of your own? Germany had the finest optics in the world, the lens makers of Jena, the mathematicians and metallurgists who set the global standard for precision firearms. If the American shotgun was so devastating, the obvious answer for an engineering nation was to manufacture a better shotgun and hand it to their own stormtroopers. They did not. Instead, they reached for the language of war crimes, and that choice, that decision to fight the weapon with a lawyer instead of with a workshop, tells you something the note itself never admitted. It tells you they had already tried to understand this gun, and something about it did not fit inside the German idea of how a weapon was supposed to be built. Something in that plain American shotgun violated a principle their entire engineering culture was built upon. To see what that was, we have to take the weapon apart, piece by piece, and find the one part that is missing. Because the crime the Germans could not forgive was hiding in an empty space inside the gun, a place where a component should have been and simply was not. Picture a German armorer in the autumn of 1918 behind the lines with a captured American shotgun laid out on a wooden table in front of him. He is a professional. He has spent his life inside the logic of German firearms, a world where every part exists for a reason. He picks up the gun. He works the action back and forth. He opens it, studies the way the parts move against each other, and then he starts looking for something. A safety component that every serious, repeating firearm of his world was expected to have. He looks. He looks again. And it is not there. Not broken. Not removed. Simply never installed because the Americans had never bothered to put it in. This is the heart of the whole story. So we have to slow down and understand exactly what he was missing and why its absence turned a hunting gun into something the German high command would call a war crime. The weapon on that table was, in almost every case, a Winchester Model 1897. It was designed by John Moses Browning, the most gifted firearms designer who has ever lived, and it was built in New Haven, Connecticut, in a factory that turned out over 1 million of these guns across its production life. But here is the thing that matters. Browning did not design this gun for war. He designed it for ducks, for farmers, for men walking a tree line at dawn, hoping to put a pheasant on the dinner table. It was a commercial hunting shotgun, sold in a catalog, and its combat version was nothing more than that same civilian gun with a shorter barrel, a steel heat shield so a soldier would not burn his hand, and a lug to fix a bayonet on the end. That was the entire modification. The Americans took a farm gun and pointed it at an empire. Now, the missing part. Modern shotguns and the fine German designs of that era contained a small mechanism called a trigger disconnector. Its job sounds boring, but follow it, because everything turns on this. A disconnector forces the shooter to release the trigger and pull it again for every single shot. Pull, release, pull, release. It is a discipline built into the steel for control, for the orderly firing of one deliberate round at a time. To a German engineer, a firearm without a disconnector was not a finished weapon. It was a defect, a gun that had failed quality control. The Model 1897 had no disconnector, and the Americans did not consider that a flaw. They considered it the point. Here is what that empty space inside the gun actually did. Because there was no disconnector, a soldier could hold the trigger all the way down and simply keep working the pump. Every time he slammed the action shut, the gun fired. He did not pull the trigger 6 times. He pulled it once, held it, and pumped as fast as his arms could move. The Americans had a name for it. They called it slam fire. A trained man with a slam-fired 12-gauge could empty the entire magazine, 6 shells, each loaded with 9 heavy buckshot pellets in roughly 5 seconds. Do the arithmetic on that. 6 shells, 9 pellets each, is 54 projectiles the size of pistol bullets, thrown down a narrow trench in the time it takes to say a single sentence. And now you can see the collision of 2 entire ways of thinking about the world. The German philosophy of arms was a philosophy of precision. Build the perfect mechanism. Machine every part to a fine tolerance. Give the trained soldier a tool that rewards his discipline and his years of drill with one accurate, deadly shot at a time. It was a beautiful idea, and it produced beautiful weapons. It was also, in the specific hell of close-quarters trench fighting, exactly the wrong idea, because the American shotgun did not care about any of that. It did not reward marksmanship. It did not reward the years the Prussian army had poured into making the finest infantry in Europe. On a battlefield of 2 or 3 meters, in the mud, around a blind corner, the shotgun erased all of it. A frightened recruit who had held a rifle for 6 weeks could point that gun at an oncoming man and, with one held trigger and a working arm, put out a wall of lead that no amount of training could dodge. That was the crime, not the wounds, the equality. The Model 1897 took the most valuable thing the German army possessed, its incomparable trained soldier, and made him no safer than a raw conscript. It took years of investment in human skill and canceled them with a hunting gun that cost a few dollars and was missing a part on purpose. And there is a final layer to this that a German engineer would have found almost insulting. The missing disconnector did not just make the gun faster, it made it simpler. Fewer parts. Easier to build by the tens of thousands in a Connecticut factory running at full speed. The Germans were looking at the gun as a flaw to be understood. The Americans had built the flaw into a feature, and the feature into a weapon of mass production. Simplicity itself was the design. So the armorer sets the gun down. He has found what is wrong with it, and what is wrong with it is that nothing is wrong with it. The empty space is the answer. But understanding the weapon on a table is one thing. Understanding what it did to men in a trench is another. And to see why the protest came exactly when it came, we have to leave the workshop and go to the place where this gun earned its name. The trench. A trench on the Western Front. The autumn of 1918. Not a wide-open battlefield with rolling fields and clear lines of fire. A trench. A narrow ditch cut into the earth, barely wider than a man's shoulders, twisting in the sharp angles so that a rush of attackers could never sweep the whole length of it at once. Mud walls, standing water, and around every corner, a blind spot, a place where you cannot see the man who is about to see you. This is where the American shotgun stopped being a hunting gun and became the thing the German High Command called a war crime. Because in a space like this, everything the German army had spent 40 years perfecting simply stopped working. Consider what the German soldier brought into that trench. The finest infantry rifle of its generation, bolt action, accurate to hundreds of meters in the hands of a man drilled to hit a target the size of a dinner plate. That rifle was a masterpiece. It was also nearly useless here, because there was no distance at all. The fight happened at 2 meters, at 1 meter, close enough that a long rifle with a long bayonet was a spear in a space too tight to swing it. The German stormtroopers, the elite units built specifically to clear enemy trenches, had trained for exactly this. And into it, the Americans brought a gun that did not need to aim, did not need distance, and did not need a trained man behind it. Now, walk it through from the German side, because the horror of it was the surprise. A German assault group moves down a captured trench, clearing it corner by corner, the way they had done 100 times against men with rifles. They come around a blind angle, expecting to trade shots with a defender, to use their numbers and their coordination. And instead of a rifleman, they meet an American with a shotgun who has already put his finger on the trigger and is holding it down. He does not aim. He points. He pumps the action once, and the corner fills with buckshot. Then again, and again. In the time it would take a rifleman to work his bolt and fire 2 careful shots, the shotgun has emptied its entire magazine, and the narrow trench has given the buckshot nowhere to spread, and a man nowhere to go. The Americans had a name for what the gun did in that space. They called it the trench broom. It swept. This is why the timing matters, and the timing is everything. The German protest did not come in 1914 or 15 or 16. It came in September of 1918 for a simple reason. That was the year the Americans arrived in force. The American Expeditionary Force, under General John Pershing, had crossed the Atlantic and was pouring fresh divisions into a war that had exhausted every other nation fighting it. And Pershing's army carried shotguns issued to the scout and raider sections of the regiments, the men whose job was exactly the close, brutal, corner-to-corner work of the trench. For 3 years, the German army had fought other men's rifles. Now, in the final year, it was meeting an enemy that had brought a tool ruthlessly suited to the one kind of fighting where German skill counted for the least. And the effect on the men in the trenches was not a rumor. It was measurable in something no army can manufacture: morale. German frontline units began to fear the sight of the weapon because there was no counter to it in the moment it mattered. You could not outshoot it up close. You could not out-train it. You could not dodge it. The wall of lead did not care how good you were. Did not. That fear, climbing up through the reports of officers who had to explain why their best assault troops were failing at their signature task, is what put the pen in the hand of the German command. The protest was not written by soldiers in a trench. It was written by a high command that had run out of tactical answers and reached for a legal one. And here is where the American answer entered the record, and it is worth savoring, because it was as blunt as the weapon itself. When the German note arrived through Switzerland, with its Hague Convention citation and its promise to execute captured Americans, the United States did not flinch. It rejected the legal argument outright. The buckshot pellet, they pointed out, was no crueler than the bullets fired by every other army in the war. And then Pershing's side delivered the part that ended the conversation. If Germany executed a single American for carrying a shotgun, the United States would answer in kind against German prisoners taken with the weapons of Germany's own arsenal, the flamethrowers and the saw-toothed bayonets that Germany had never seen fit to call war crimes. It was a checkmate dressed as a warning. Germany had accused America of barbarism while holding a torch in its own hand, and America had pointed at the torch. The threat evaporated. As far as anyone knows, not one American was ever executed for carrying a shotgun, and not one German for carrying a flamethrower. So the case reached a standstill. The accusation was made, the weapon kept firing, and the war ground toward its end. And that should have been the whole story. A strange footnote in a strange war, a gun that swept trenches for a few months and then went into a crate to be forgotten. Except it was not forgotten, because 24 years later, on the other side of the planet, in a place with no trenches at all, that same American gun would come back, and the crime Germany could not answer would be committed again. Guadalcanal, 1942. The other side of the world, from the mud of France, and 24 years later. There are no trenches here. There is jungle. Green so thick you cannot see 10 feet. Roots that grab your boots. Heat that soaks a man to the bone before he has walked 100 yards. And moving along a narrow jungle trail at the very front of a Marine patrol is the point man. The most dangerous job in the squad. The first man the enemy will meet. The first man who will die if the enemy is waiting. And in his hands is not a rifle. It is a pump-action shotgun. The same weapon, in all but name, that his father might have carried in the trenches of the last war. The gun Germany had tried to outlaw as a war crime was back. And this time, it was hunting a different enemy, in a place the men who wrote that protest could never have imagined. Here is what makes this the strangest turn in the whole story. The German note was ancient history by 1942. The war it belonged to was over. The empire that had written it no longer existed. And yet the exact thing that had terrified German stormtroopers in the trenches, a fast, close, unaimed wall of buckshot, was now doing the same work in the Pacific, because the problem had not changed. The problem was close combat. The problem was fighting an enemy at arm's length, in the dark, in a space where a rifle was too long and too slow. In the trenches, it had been a corner of mud. In the Pacific, it was a wall of jungle and, later, the black mouth of a bunker. Different war, different enemy, same math. And America already had the answer because it had built the answer a generation earlier and never thrown it away. Now the numbers, because this is where American industry enters the story and never leaves it. This was not a handful of old guns pulled out of a museum. The United States government purchased more than 80,000 of the newer model, the Winchester Model 12, for the Marines, the Army, the Navy, and the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. 80,000! The combat guns rolled off the line at Winchester in a serial range that collectors can still trace today, running from roughly 939,000 up past 1,000,000, produced between the spring of 1942 and early 1944. This was a weapon written into the official structure of the fighting force. The Marine Corps Table of Organization, the master document that decided exactly what every division would carry, called for 306 shotguns per division. Not as an afterthought, as standard equipment, and the men at the top carried them too. General Alexander Patch, who commanded American forces on Guadalcanal, was personally seen leading an attack with a Winchester shotgun in his hands. But here is the part of the story that separates a good weapon from a war-winning one, and it has nothing to do with the gun. It has to do with a single, humble, almost invisible problem: the ammunition. When those first shotguns went into the jungle, they were loaded with shells made the old way with paper hulls, and the jungle destroyed them. The humidity of the Pacific, the constant wet, the rot in the air, soaked into the paper. The shells swelled. They bloated inside the magazine tube until they jammed the gun solid. A soldier could be standing in front of an enemy with the finest close-range weapon ever built and pull the pump to find it frozen, choked by a swollen paper shell that had absorbed the jungle like a sponge. The perfect weapon was being defeated by wet cardboard. And this is the moment that defines what American superiority actually meant in this war. It did not mean a genius invention. It meant an industrial system that could see a small problem and solve it fast, at scale. The answer came from the last war. Back in 1918, the same paper shell problem in the trenches had been fixed with shells made of solid brass, impervious to moisture, unbothered by rain or mud or damp. So American industry reached back a generation, pulled out that old brass-cased buckshot design, and put it back into production for the jungle. Brass does not swell. Brass does not rot. The shells fed and fired no matter how wet the world around them became. A weapon that had been failing was suddenly working perfectly, and the fix was not a new gun. It was a better cartridge, drawn from an institutional memory that no other combatant in the Pacific could match. Think about what that chain actually is, because it is the real weapon, and the gun is only the tip of it. A simple, rugged design from a hunting catalog. A moisture-proof cartridge borrowed from the last war. A factory in Connecticut turning out over 80,000 units. An organization that wrote the weapon into the official structure of every division. That is not one clever thing. That is a system, front to back, and the enemy in the Pacific had no equal to it, just as the Germans had no equal to it before them. Japan did not lack for brave soldiers or capable weapons. What no one on the other side had built was this: the combination of a proven design, a solved logistics problem, and the industrial muscle to deliver both to a jungle trail on the far side of the ocean in the quantity a war demanded. So the gun Germany had called a crime came back, and it worked, and it kept working precisely because it was never really about the gun. It was about everything standing behind the gun. But there is one last place this weapon turned up in the Second World War, a place stranger than any jungle trail that shows just how deep into the American war machine it reached. A place surrounded by barbed wire, guarding a secret that would end the war, and the shotgun was standing at the gate. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a place that did not appear on any map. Behind the fences of a facility marked Y-12, tens of thousands of people worked around the clock on the single most guarded secret of the war, enriching the uranium that would go into the atomic bomb. Security was total, and standing guard at that gate, in the hands of a sentry who did not know what he was protecting, was a Winchester Model 12 shotgun. We know this because one of those exact guns survives, stamped with the markings of the plant it defended, Y-12, and the initials of the company that ran it. Sit with that image for a moment. The weapon Imperial Germany had condemned as too barbaric for civilized war, the gun it swore to execute men for carrying, was now the last line of defense around the birth of the atomic age. From a duck hunting catalog, to the trenches of France, to the jungles of the Pacific, to the gate of the most important secret on Earth. One simple American gun, everywhere the war was decided. Now let us return to the crime and finally deliver the verdict, because the case Germany opened in 1918 was never actually closed. Remember how it ended, or rather, how it did not end. Germany had demanded a reply to its protest by cable before the 1st of October, 1918. The Americans sent their refusal, their rejection of the legal argument, their promise of reprisal, and to that, Germany gave no real answer at all. The protest simply stopped. And then something final happened. Almost exactly 4 months to the day after Germany discovered that American shotguns had entered the fight, the war ended. Not with a debate over the Hague Convention, not with a tribunal, with Germany's surrender on the 11th of November, 1918. The accusation of a war crime evaporated into the air, unanswered and unresolved, and the men who had made it laid down their arms. As far as history records, not one American was ever executed for carrying a shotgun, and not one German was ever punished for carrying a flamethrower. The threat was empty. The crime was never tried. There was no verdict. So here at the end, we can finally answer the question we asked at the very beginning. What has to happen for the most engineering-obsessed army on Earth to look at a hunting gun and call it a war crime? The answer is not cruelty. The buckshot was no crueler than the bullet. The answer is defeat. Not defeat on the battlefield alone, but a deeper kind, an engineering defeat. The German protest was never really a moral document. It was a confession. It was the sound of a great technical nation admitting that it had met a weapon it could not answer on its own terms. Follow that logic all the way down, because it is the whole point of this story. Germany had every tool it needed to build a shotgun of its own. It had the finest metallurgists in the world, the best optics, and arms industry that set the global standard. If the American trench gun was so devastating, the obvious response for an engineering superpower was to manufacture a better one and put it in the hands of its own soldiers. It never did. And the reason it never did is the reason this whole story matters. The American gun was not beatable on the German model of what a weapon should be. It won not by being more precise, but by being simpler. It won by throwing away the very refinement the German engineer worshipped. And a nation cannot copy a philosophy it refuses to believe in. Faced with a weapon that violated their deepest engineering principle, the German command could not outbuild it. So they tried to outlaw it. The lawyer was called in because the workshop had failed. And that is the quiet truth beneath the whole strange episode. The protest was not a sign of American barbarism. It was a monument to American ingenuity, written in the enemy's own hand. When your opponent cannot defeat your weapon and cannot reproduce it, and reaches instead for a piece of paper and the language of law, that piece of paper is not an accusation. It is a trophy. Let us be careful and fair here, because the honest version of this story is more impressive than the myth. This is not a claim that America won the world wars alone, or that the courage and sacrifice of the Allies and the Soviet Union counted for less. It did not. Empires were broken by many hands. This is something narrower and, in its way, more remarkable. It is the story of one specific technical problem, close quarters combat, and one nation that solved it so completely, so early, and so cheaply that its enemies could neither match the solution nor legislate it away. That is not a boast about who won the war. It is a fact about who solved the problem. And the proof of how completely it was solved is written in the years that followed. The shotgun did not retire when the guns fell silent in the Pacific. More than 30,000 of them remained in American arsenals at the end of the Second World War, oiled and crated and waiting. They were pulled back out for Korea in the 1950s. They were carried again in the jungles of Vietnam in the 1960s. The same basic weapon, the same simple idea, the same missing part that a German armorer had once mistaken for a flaw, kept going to war for the better part of a century. No law ever banned it. No engineer ever bettered it at its own job. It simply outlasted every argument ever made against it. So this is the verdict, delivered not by a court, but by history itself. The note that traveled out of Bern in the autumn of 1918 was never a case that could be won, because it was never really about a crime. It was about a hunting gun from a Connecticut catalog that did something the finest military engineers in the world had declared impossible and kept doing it, war after war, while the empire that called it illegal passed into the pages of history. The Germans were right about one thing. The weapon was unfair. It was unfair the way a solved problem is always unfair to the people who could not solve it. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If the story held you alike, genuinely helps it reach more people who care about history, told this way. And if you are not yet subscribed, I would be glad to have you along for the next one.